The storm that night was not merely a weather event. It was a profound manifestation of the Amazon's primordial fury, a violent assault that seemed determined to flatten the small wooden cabin hidden within the dark, emerald heart of the rainforest. The wind howled through the narrow cracks in the window frames with the sound of 1,000 mourning spirits carrying the heavy scent of rain-drenched earth and decaying ancient vegetation. Rain hammered the corrugated tin roof with a deafening, rhythmic ferocity that turned the interior of the shack into a vibrating echo chamber. Inside, the only source of light came from a single kerosene lantern that swayed gently from a ceiling beam, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the walls lined with survival gear, topographic maps, and the silent relics of a life once defined by violence. Marcus, a 46-year-old man with salt and pepper hair falling to his shoulders and a jagged, prominent scar running down the left side of his neck, sat at the heavy mahogany table. He did not flinch at the thunder that shook the very foundations of the structure. Instead, his calloused hands moved with the surgical precision of a Tier 1 operator as he performed a routine maintenance check on his tactical 12-gauge shotgun. He wiped down each internal component with a cloth soaked in mineral oil, feeling the mechanical resistance of the steel and checking every spring and pin with a focus that was almost religious. For Marcus, this routine was a form of tactical meditation, a lingering habit from his years as a Navy SEAL officer, where trust in one's equipment was the final barrier between survival and a shallow grave in a foreign land. Lying on a rug made of natural fibers beside him, Max watched every movement his handler made. The Sable German Shepherd was a massive, imposing animal, his powerful musculature a testament to years of grueling military training and field operations. The dog's left ear bore a small, distinctive notch, a combat scar he carried with the same quiet dignity as the man he served. Max was far more than a companion. He was a biological early warning system, a partner whose senses were infinitely more attuned to the shifting environment than any human technology. At that moment, the dog's ears twitched independently, capturing a sound that the roar of the rain was trying desperately to camouflage. He rose slowly, without a single whimper, but the fur along his spine bristled and a low, subsonic growl began to vibrate deep within his chest. Marcus noticed the change instantly. He abandoned the cleaning of the weapon and, in one fluid, silent motion, reassembled the bolt carrier and fed a heavy slug into the magazine tube. He did not need to look at Max to know that something, or someone, was approaching the cabin under the cover of the deluge. The knock at the door was violent and fueled by desperation, momentarily overriding the sound of the thunder. Marcus moved with the practiced economy of a predator, positioning himself at an angle that gave him a tactical advantage over the entryway. He held the shotgun firmly against his shoulder, his finger indexed along the receiver, just above the trigger guard. With his boot, he kicked the manual deadbolt open and swung the heavy door inward. A mist of cold rainwater sprayed into the room, bringing with it a feminine silhouette that looked as though it had been spat out by the jungle itself. The woman was drenched, her high-end expedition clothing clinging to her shivering frame, and her eyes, wide and expressive, shone with a mixture of utter exhaustion and raw panic. Before she could speak, Marcus kept the muzzle of his weapon directed at her chest, though he maintained his discipline, waiting for her to make the first move in the small, tension-filled space. Marcus said with a voice that sounded like grinding gravel, "Freeze right where you are. Identify yourself, and give me a single reason why I shouldn't consider you a threat to this perimeter." The woman took a step back, nearly tripping over her own boots, but she managed to catch her balance against the doorframe. She was clutching a silver aluminum briefcase against her chest, as if it were the most valuable object in the universe. The cold made her tremble uncontrollably, and the flickering light of the lantern revealed a face of striking, haunting beauty, features that were far too refined for the brutal environment she had just emerged from. She struggled to catch her breath, attempting to steady her voice while staring into the dark bore of the shotgun, and then at the dog that looked ready to tear her apart at a moment's notice. The woman replied, her voice nearly breaking under the weight of the cold, "My name is Elena. I am not a threat. I swear it. I have walked for miles through this storm because I was told you were the only man left in this jungle who still understood the meaning of a debt of honor. I don't want your life, Marcus. I need your skills, and I am prepared to pay any price you name for them." Marcus did not relax his guard. He signaled for Max to remain in a stay command and nodded for her to step inside, away from the lashing rain. He kicked the door shut, sliding the bolt back into place and restoring the heavy, humid silence of the cabin. Elena walked to the wooden table, the very place where Marcus had been cleaning his weapon, and placed the briefcase on the surface with a heavy thud. With fingers that were blue from the cold, she snapped the metallic latches open. The dry, mechanical sound of the locks releasing seemed to echo through the small room. When she lifted the lid, the lantern light reflected off something that would have made any ordinary man lose his mind. Stacked bundles of $100 bills, tied tightly in thick bricks, filled nearly every inch of the case. Beside the cash, 3 heavy stamped bars of solid gold rested on a velvet lining, glowing with a dull, intoxicating luster. It was a fortune that could buy entire villages, an amount of wealth that represented everything Marcus had tried to leave behind when he chose to disappear into the heart of the Amazon. Marcus said, without so much as a glance at the money, his eyes fixed firmly on Elena's face. "I don't have a price, Elena, and that money has no value out here, where the only currencies that matter are fuel, clean water, and ammunition. Close that case, and walk back out the way you came before the trail turns into a river of mud." Elena shook her head slowly, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her pale cheek. She did not seem surprised by his refusal. She knew that it would take more than greed to move the man standing before her. With a slow, deliberate movement, she reached into the inner pocket of her waterproof jacket and withdrew a small, clear plastic envelope. Inside was an old photograph, its edges yellowed and the image slightly faded by the passage of decades. She slid the envelope across the table, over the stacks of currency, until it came to a rest directly in front of Marcus. Elena replied, in a whisper that carried the weight of 20 years of silence. "I didn't come here to buy you, Marcus. I came because this photograph is the only lead I have left. They call it the Path of Stars, a place many believe is a myth, but I know it is real. I have 48 hours to reach it, or the people who have been holding him for all this time will make sure he is never seen again. And you know exactly who the man in the center of this photo is, don't you?" Marcus lowered the shotgun slowly, the weight of the weapon suddenly feeling immense. He picked up the plastic envelope with fingers that trembled slightly, a rare lapse in his iron discipline. The image showed a group of young soldiers in tiger-stripe camouflage uniforms, sweating and smiling in front of a dense wall of jungle foliage. In the center of the group stood a man with a steady gaze, and his arm draped over the shoulder of a much younger Marcus, who at the time bore no scars and had hair that was still pitch black. It was the face of the man Marcus considered his mentor, the brother-in-arms he had sworn to protect, and whom he believed he had lost to a tactical error during a chaotic extraction years ago. The impact of that image was more powerful than any explosive shockwave he had ever survived. He felt his heart hammer against his ribs, a surge of urgency he thought had died in the sand of distant deserts. Marcus said, while Max leaned in to sniff the envelope, letting out a low, mournful whine of recognition. "Where did you get this? This man? He isn't supposed to be alive. No one survives the coordinates where that mission went dark. Not after 20 years. Elena replied, taking a step closer, seeing that she had finally found the crack in the veteran's armor. "He survived, Marcus, but he is not free. He is at the end of the Path of Stars, waiting for someone with the courage to cross through hell to find him. The money in the case is for whatever expenses you incur. But what I am offering you is the chance to finish the mission you left incomplete 2 decades ago. Will you take me there?" Marcus looked at the photo, then at the money, and finally at Max. The dog looked back at him, his intelligent eyes seemingly reading his handler's soul. There was no longer any need for debate. The storm outside continued to rage, but the internal conflict within Marcus had been settled. The past was not dead. It was merely buried beneath the roots of the jungle, waiting to be exhumed. The frantic pace of that desperate negotiation gave way to a cold, hard determination. He knew that what he was about to do was tactical madness, a plunge into the unknown that would likely cost them their lives. But the sentinel of the jungle could not ignore the call of a ghost, Marcus said, tucking the photo into his vest pocket and slamming the aluminum briefcase shut with a decisive snap. We move out at first light. The path of stars does not forgive mistakes, and the jungle will try to swallow us with every step we take. Get some rest, Elena. If you are lying to me, I will personally ensure you never find your way out of these woods. Max, back to your post. Tomorrow, we go back to work. Max barked once, a sharp, authoritative sound that seemed to cut through the remaining tension in the room. Elena sighed, her knees nearly buckling with relief, while Marcus began to organize his field gear with methodical speed. The first block of that journey had been sealed with gold, blood, and an ancient promise. The time for speed had ended. Now, every second would be a slow, dangerous negotiation with the rainforest itself. They were about to step into a territory where the stars did not just guide the navigators, but also the dead. Marcus checked his compass, verified the load in his pack, and felt the familiar weight of responsibility return to his shoulders. The mission had begun, and this time there would be no retreat. He looked at the bolt on the door, knowing that when he opened it the next morning, he would no longer be just a hermit in hiding. But the officer the jungle had never forgotten. The rain continued its relentless assault, a rhythmic percussion that underscored the gravity of the decision Marcus had just made. He stood by the window for a long time, staring out into the absolute darkness where the trees bent under the will of the wind. He could feel the presence of the man in the photograph, a ghost from a past life that was now calling him back to the fray. The cabin, once a sanctuary of peace, now felt like a staging area for a final, desperate operation. Max settled back onto his rug, but his eyes remained open, reflecting the dying light of the lantern as he watched his handler prepare for the inevitable. The silent pact between man and dog had been renewed, forged in the fires of past battles, and now tempered by the promise of a final reckoning. Marcus picked up his sharpening stone and began to hone the edge of his fixed blade knife. The sound of steel on stone was a low, grating rasp that matched the intensity of his thoughts. He thought of the man in the photo, the colonel who had taught him how to survive in environments that were designed to kill. If he was truly still out there, at the end of a mythical trail, then the world was a far more complex and dangerous place than Marcus had allowed himself to believe. He felt the old instincts returning, the heightened awareness, the constant scanning for threats, the cold clarity that only comes when life and death are balanced on the edge of a blade. Elena had fallen into a fitful sleep on the small cot in the corner, her breathing ragged and uneven. Marcus watched her for a moment, wondering about the secrets she was still keeping. He knew that no one comes into the heart of the Amazon with a briefcase full of gold without having a trail of shadows behind them. But for now, those shadows were a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, he would prepare. He would double-check every magazine, every medical kit, and every ration pack. He would ensure that Max was ready for the physical toll the mountains would take on him. The Path of Stars was not just a destination, it was a gauntlet, and Marcus intended to be the one who made it to the other side. As the lantern finally sputtered and died, leaving the room in a thick, velvety darkness, Marcus sat in the silence, listening to the heartbeat of the jungle. He felt a strange sense of peace, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. The ambiguity of his life in hiding had been replaced by the absolute certainty of a mission. He was a soldier again, and the mission was clear. Find the colonel, protect the girl, and survive the Path of Stars. He reached out and patted Max's head in the dark, a silent confirmation of their shared fate. The morning would come soon enough, and with it, the beginning of a journey that would change everything. The Amazon was waiting, its vast, indifferent beauty hiding the horrors they would soon face. But as Marcus closed his eyes for a few hours of tactical rest, he knew one thing for certain. The Sentinel was back, and he wouldn't stop until the mission was complete. The darkness of the cabin seemed to expand, filled with the ghosts of Marcus's past. He could almost see the faces of the men he had served with, the ones who didn't make it back, their eyes judging him from the shadows. He had carried their weight for so long, a burden of guilt and survivor's remorse that had driven him into this self-imposed exile. But the photo Elena had brought changed the narrative. If the colonel was alive, then maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for redemption. Maybe the mission wasn't a failure, just a long-delayed objective. This thought gave Marcus a focus he hadn't felt in decades. He wasn't just running towards a ghost. He was running towards a version of himself he thought he had lost forever. Max shifted in his sleep, his paws twitching as he chased imaginary enemies in his dreams. Marcus knew that the dog felt the change too. The bond between them, forged in the heat of combat and refined in the solitude of the jungle, was their greatest asset. They were a single unit, a symbiotic pair that moved and thought as one. In the trials to come, that bond would be tested to its absolute limit. The Path of Stars was said to be a place where the physical and the spiritual blurred, where the jungle tested not just your strength, but your sanity. Marcus steeled his mind, calling upon the mental conditioning he had undergone years ago. He would not break. He would not falter. He would be the anchor for Elena and the shield for Max. Outside, the storm began to show the first signs of abating. The thunder was more distant now, a low rumble that felt like a parting threat. The rain had settled into a steady, persistent drizzle that would likely last for days, turning the forest floor into a treacherous morass. Marcus knew the challenges of the terrain, the mud, the leeches, the hidden ravines, and the predators that would be emboldened by the wet weather. But he also knew the advantages. The rain would mask their scent and their tracks, making it harder for anyone following them to stay on their tail. It was a trade-off he was willing to make. He was a creature of the shadows and the rain, and in this environment, he was the apex predator. As the first hint of gray light began to bleed through the canopy and into the cabin, Marcus stood up. His movements were slow and deliberate, a quiet preparation for the violence that lay ahead. He looked at Elena, still asleep, and then at Max, who was already awake and watching him with ears pricked. The time for rest was over. The path was open, and the stars, even if hidden by the clouds, were waiting. He reached for his pack, the weight of it a familiar comfort, and prepared to step out into the world he had tried to forget. The mission was a go. The sentinel was moving, and the jungle, in all its ancient and terrible majesty, was ready to receive them. The pre-dawn gloom was not a void, but a heavy, pulsating presence that seemed to transform the Amazon into an immense, stagnant ocean of gray mist. The furious storm of the previous night had settled into a persistent, ghostly drizzle, a veil of humidity that seeped into every crevice of the cabin, making the air feel thick, cold, and difficult to draw into the lungs. Marcus had not slept. He had spent the hours leading up to first light, sitting in his worn wicker chair, watching Elena as she drifted through a fitful, restless sleep on the makeshift cot in the corner of the room. He watched her with the clinical coldness of a sentinel, analyzing the cadence of her breathing, the way her hands twitched in her sleep, and the manner in which she curled into herself beneath the heavy military blanket. To Marcus, every detail was a piece of intelligence. He was trying to discern if this woman was a genuine victim of circumstance or a carefully placed asset in a game far more dangerous than she let on. The mental fog that the photograph of his old mentor had triggered still hung over him like a low-pressure system, a mix of disbelief and a surging urgency he had thought was long since buried beneath the roots of the giant trees outside. The smell of kerosene from the lantern, which was now dying with a flickering orange glow, was gradually replaced by the strong, earthy aroma of coffee brewing on a small, portable camping stove. The sound of water bubbling within the metal pot was the only noise that broke the heavy silence of the early morning, a sound that, for Marcus, brought a painful, sharp clarity to his thoughts. He poured the dark, steaming liquid into an enameled metal mug, feeling the intense heat emanate from the vessel and warm his calloused hands. His scars, particularly the jagged line across his neck, seemed to pulse slightly with the change in atmospheric pressure and the biting dampness of the air.
He took the first sip, letting the deep bitterness of the coffee sharpen his senses in silence. For a fleeting moment, the whirlwind of tactical memories and ghosts of the past that had been haunting him since he opened that clear plastic envelope. Each gulp was a ritual ready, a way to anchor his mind in the present, while the past attempted to drag him back to coordinates of a miss should never have ended in tragedy.
Max had been awake long before the first hint of grey light appeared through the canopy. The dog remained seated near the bolted door, a motionless statue of muscle, nerves, and absolute vigilance. His nostrils worked in a frantic rhythmic motion, capturing and processing the sense of the forest as it awakened outside. The smell of rotting wood, the damp trail of a creature that had passed by during the storm, and the residual static electricity that still lingered in the air after the midnight lightning. The Sable German Shepherd looked at Marcus, and there was an exchange of looks between them that dispensed with any need for vocalization. The animal knew, with an instinct honed by years of actual warfare, that the routine of isolation and silence had come to a definitive end. He watched Marcus handle the canvas rucksacks and the polymer belts with a methodical seriousness that only emerged when survival was the sole viable objective. Max rose silently, his notched left ear twitching to catch the distant sound of a snapping branch, and approached his handler, leaning his head against Marcus's hand as if sealing a pact for yet another journey into the unknown. Marcus began the meticulous ritual of gear inspection. He was in no hurry. In the jungle, haste was the first step toward a terminal error. He checked every item in his tactical pack with an attention that bordered on the obsessive. First, the MREs, vacuum-sealed pouches containing the caloric fuel necessary to sustain days of forced marching through steep, muddy terrain. He felt the weight of each packet, checking the integrity of the plastic and mentally verifying expiration dates. Next, the trauma kit, a compact red bag containing rapid application tourniquets, advanced hemostatic agents, and compression bandages. These were the tools of trauma he sincerely hoped not to use, but knew with a dark intimacy inherited from Tier 1 operations across the globe. He slid his fixed-blade knife into its polymer sheath attached to his belt, feeling the perfect fit and hearing the dull, muffled thud of metal meeting its housing, a sound that for him was the final signal that the time for rest had expired. He checked the balance of his pack, adjusting the straps so the center of gravity sat exactly over his hips, minimizing the strain on his already tensed muscles. Next, he turned to Max to begin the process of equipping the dog. The animal remained perfectly still, paws firmly planted on the wooden floor, as Marcus slid the reinforced ballistic nylon harness over his body. Marcus adjusted each strap with minute care, ensuring there was no excessive friction under the dog's forelegs, yet making sure the gear was tight enough to allow Max to be hoisted by ropes or carried over shoulders if the terrain became impassable. He attached the side water bladders, distributing the weight evenly, and checked the condition of the dog's paw pads, which would be subjected to immense physical stress in the kilometers to come. Max exuded a quiet readiness, his intelligent brown eyes fixed on every movement Marcus made, demonstrating a level of trust that only years of partnership in extreme situations could build. Marcus said to the dog, his voice low, grave, and laden with a paternal authority, "We're going back into the game, partner. Stay sharp on every movement in the bush. The jungle isn't going to give us a break today, and this woman we're guiding is a variable I haven't quite calculated yet. Keep her flank secure, but never take your eyes off our six. Understood?" Max responded with a subtle tilt of his head and a light thump of his tail against the cabin floor, a sign that he understood the gravity of the mission perfectly. Marcus then turned to Elena, who had just awakened due to the smell of the coffee and the contained noise of the preparations. She sat up on the cot, her hair slightly disheveled, and her pale face marked by the short, restless night. But her eyes met Marcus's with a determination that he, reluctantly, began to respect. She no longer looked like the fragile woman who had stumbled through the door during the storm. Now, there was a rigidity of purpose in her that he recognized in soldiers about to step into their first real engagement. Marcus said, as he served a mug of coffee to the woman and handed her a packet of energy rations. "Eat everything now. We won't be stopping for meals until the sun hits its zenith. The trail we're following allows for no physical weakness or mental hesitation. If you can't maintain a forced march pace, I won't be carrying you. The path of stars is a meat grinder, and the Amazon will try to extract every drop of sweat and every gram of will you possess. If you're hiding any secrets that could get us killed out there, this is the time to speak." Elena accepted the mug with hands that still shook slightly, but she drank the hot, bitter liquid without a single sound of complaint. She seemed to be processing the reality that the man before her was not a tour guide, but a warrior who viewed the world through a prism of tactical threats and mission objectives. She ate the rations with a mechanical efficiency, ignoring the artificial taste and focusing only on the sustenance it would provide for the challenges awaiting beyond the cabin door. Elena replied, her voice gaining strength as the heat of the coffee took effect. "I won't slow you down, Marcus. I've spent years studying this terrain, the river currents and the rock formations. I know what's at stake much better than you imagine. What you see as the weakness of a stranger, I call the motivation of someone who has nothing left to lose. Just give me the order, and I will follow it without question." Marcus did not respond with words. He finished loading his shotgun, feeling the solid weight of the 12-gauge slugs in the weapon's magazine. He placed it on his tactical sling, letting it rest across his chest in a ready position, where the barrel could be raised in a fraction of a second if an enemy, human or animal, emerged from the dense vegetation. He picked up his pack, which now weighed nearly 70 pounds with the additional supplies and backup batteries for the electronic gear, and threw it over his shoulders in a single, powerful motion. The weight was familiar, a constant pressure that seemed to anchor his existence to the reality of this impossible mission. Marcus said, while checking his compass and map one last time before stepping out, "Follow exactly in my footsteps. Do not touch any plant, branch, or stone that has not been authorized by me. The Amazon has 1,000 silent ways to kill you before you even realize you've made a mistake. Max will go ahead as a scout. If he stops, you become a statue. If he growls, you hit the dirt and protect your neck. Are we clear?" Elena replied, tightening the straps of her own pack firmly. "Clear. I'll do exactly as you say, without hesitation." Marcus opened the bolt of the door and pushed it wide. The change in environment was instantaneous and brutal. The humid, stifling heat of the Amazonian morning enveloped the group like a soaked, heavy blanket. The sound of the forest was a constant, deafening hum, a mixture of millions of insects, the distant cry of birds of prey, and the incessant dripping of water falling from giant leaves to a ground already saturated by the night's rain. The mist was so thick that visibility barely exceeded a few meters, transforming the colossal trunks of the trees into twisted ghosts that seemed to watch the intruders enter their sacred domain. They began the walk, in absolute silence. The pace was slow, almost ceremonial, proportional to the density of the mystery that awaited them. Every step Marcus took was calculated with tactical precision. He observed the color and texture of the soil, looking for signs of quicksand or areas where the ground might give way. He constantly looked up, checking for vines that might house camouflage snakes or venomous spiders. The silence between the three was broken only by the muffled sound of their boots sinking into the soft soil and the occasional snapping of dry branches that had not been overcome by the humidity. Max moved with a lethal elegance that contrasted with the harshness of the environment. He slid silently through the ferns and exposed roots, his sable coat serving as perfect natural camouflage under the filtered light of the canopy. Every so often, the dog would stop and tilt his head, capturing vibrations and sounds far beyond human perception. In these pauses, Marcus would also freeze, his right hand resting on the butt of the shotgun, his eyes scanning the perimeter in a 180-degree arc with a paranoia trained by decades of special operations. As he walked, Marcus's mind could not disconnect from the photograph Elena had brought him. He saw the face of his old mentor, superimposed over the shadows of the forest, an image that evoked memories of a time when he believed implicitly in concepts like glory and unquestionable duty. He vividly remembered the last time he had seen that man, under a leaden sky much like this one, during a border operation that had turned into a tactical massacre. The sound of his teammates' screams, the smell of cordite, and the feeling of deep failure as he watched his unit being decimated were psychological scars he had unsuccessfully tried to cauterize through isolation. Now, with every meter traveled toward the path of stars, he felt he was exhuming not just an old soldier, but a version of himself he had sworn never to let resurface. Marcus said to himself, in a whisper that barely rose above the sound of leaves crushed beneath his feet. 20 years is too long for someone to remain human in the heart of this bush. If we find what's left of him, will I be ready for what I see? Elena, walking right behind him, seemed to notice the tension in Marcus's shoulders but kept her promise of silence. She struggled against the weight of the pack and the humidity that made her clothes stick to her skin, but she kept pace, her eyes fixed on the back of Marcus's head. There was a resilience in her that the veteran began to notice and, secretly, to value. He wondered what the real story was behind her interest in this rescue. Was she the daughter of the man in the photo? A distant relative? Or perhaps just a piece in a corporate or military espionage scheme he hadn't yet managed to unravel? They reached the bank of a stream that the storm had transformed into a muddy, fast, and dangerous flow. Marcus stopped, watching the eddies of water carrying plant debris and smaller logs with the force of a hydraulic press. He picked up a long branch and tested the depth and resistance of the sandy bed. Crossing rivers in the Amazon was one of the most dangerous tasks of a march, where a simple slip could result in drowning or being swept into underwater tangles where rescue would be impossible. Marcus said, turning to Elena with a stern look, "We cross here. The water will come up to your waist, and the current will be strong enough to try to knock you down. Keep your knees slightly bent and grab the top handle of my pack with both hands. Do not try to fight the water. Use my weight as an anchor. Max, find the stablest channel." The dog moved cautiously into the water, feeling the pressure of the current against his muscular legs. He found a passage where the bed consisted of larger, more stable rocks, crossing with impressive technique until reaching the other bank, where he shook himself to remove the excess weight from his wet fur. Marcus then reached out his arm to Elena, guiding her into the cold water. The thermal shock was evident in her expression, but she gripped Marcus's pack handle with a strength that demonstrated her survival instinct. The roar of the water was loud, a constant presence that drowned out any attempt at dialogue. Marcus felt the brute force of the current pushing against his thighs, trying to find a gap in his stance. He walked sideways, keeping his body leaned against the force of the water, digging the tips of his boots into the irregular bed. In the middle of the crossing, a drifting log brushed past them, a mass of dead wood that could have broken a limb with ease. Marcus positioned his body as a human shield between the log and Elena, feeling the dull impact on his hip, but he did not allow the group's balance to be compromised. When they finally reached the opposite bank, Elena was panting and pale, her soaked clothes adding several kilograms to her burden. Marcus helped her up the red earth embankment and signaled for her to take shelter for a few minutes under the immense canopy of a ceiba tree, whose buttress roots created small, natural enclosures that felt like the walls of an organic castle. The air there was a little cooler, but the humidity remained a constant physical presence. Elena said, while trying to control her breathing and wipe the water from her face, "Thank you. For a moment, I thought the current was going to take me." "You didn't hesitate to protect me from that log," Marcus said, as he checked if the shotgun barrel had been obstructed by debris or mud during the crossing. "Don't thank me for doing my job. I am responsible for the integrity of this mission, and you dead at the bottom of a river is of no use to me. That stream was just a free sample. The path of stars goes up toward the ridges, where the terrain becomes a staircase of mud and loose stones. Take advantage of this rest, as it will be the last in many hours of marching." He looked at the necklace of black seeds and animal teeth the indigenous boy had given him on the previous mission, which he now wore wrapped around his left wrist, alongside his high-precision tactical watch. He felt a strange and inevitable connection between that past mission and the mystery unfolding now, as if the forest were weaving a web of events destined to force him to confront all his sins at once. Max sat beside him, his ears in constant motion, watching the trail they had just left behind. The dogs seemed to share Marcus's instinctive distrust. They weren't just walking, they were being watched by an environment that knows nothing of compassion. The weight of the silence in those depths of the forest was almost tangible, a dense mass that seemed to drown out even the loudest thoughts. It was a silence that brought no peace, but rather an expectation charged with latent danger. It was the silence of a predator that knows exactly where its prey is, and just waits for the statistically perfect moment for the strike. Marcus knew that the path of stars was not just a point on a geographic map, but a psychological journey through the darkest zones of the human soul, where his past and Elena's fortune would inevitably collide. He looked up, but the leaden clouds prevented any glimpse of the sky. Nevertheless, he felt the stars were there, watching every step of that slow and potentially deadly dance between redemption and destruction. Marcus said, standing up with the weight of the pack and offering his hand for Elena to do the same. The rest period has expired. The trail ahead becomes steeper, and the ground will be even more unstable. Keep absolute focus and your mouth shut. From this point on, every sound we make is an open invitation for trouble we don't want to manage right now. Let's move. They resumed the march, gradually disappearing among the colossal shadows of the trees that looked like pillars of an ancient and forgotten temple. Block 2 of that journey was only in its early phase, and the slowness of the walk was a reflection of the complexity of the mystery that enveloped them. The Amazon, in its majestic and cruel indifference, seemed to close right behind them, erasing their footsteps with the accelerated growth of vegetation and the constant dripping of rain, as if it wanted to ensure that, should they fail, no one would ever find the site of their fall. The burden on Marcus's shoulders seemed to increase with every kilometer traveled, but he did not emit a single sigh of fatigue. He was a man forged in scars and the strict fulfillment of duty, and the path of stars was just another scar waiting to be opened in the flesh of his history. He felt the smell of rain mix with the smell of adrenaline that was beginning to pump through his circulatory system. The pace was slow, but the emotional and tactical intensity was absolute. He looked at Max, the tireless and loyal scout, and felt a small and rare spark of hope. If anyone had the ability to cross that green hell and return with the truth, it would be the two of them. Elena was the disturbing element, the variable that had changed the equation of his isolated life. As they climbed the muddy slope, Marcus thought about the briefcase of money left in the relative safety of the cabin. He didn't feel a shred of regret for not taking it with him. Gold was too heavy for someone who needs to be light on their feet, and honor was the only currency that still held its maximum value in the forbidden territory of the Path of Stars. He tightened his grip on the shotgun sling and continued to climb, 1 centimeter at a time, into the green immensity that knows neither forgetfulness nor forgiveness. The climb towards the highlands of the reserve began to take a physical toll that the humidity of the plain had only suggested. As the group moved into what Marcus knew was the heart of the primary forest, the vegetation changed in appearance, becoming taller, darker, and infinitely more silent. There, the cedars and ironwoods rose like columns of a forgotten Gothic temple, with canopies so dense that sunlight, even at noon, was filtered into beams of a sickly and spectral green. The ground, covered by a thick layer of leaf litter that never dried, muffled the sound of the boots, transforming the march into a ghostly displacement. Marcus felt sweat trickling down under his tactical vest, a salty trail that irritated his skin and pooled at the base of his spine, but he did not allow the discomfort to alter his posture. He walked with his knees slightly bent, weight distributed to ensure any sudden movement could be converted into a defensive reaction. The 12-gauge shotgun rested in his arms as an extension of his own body, the barrel moving in sync with his gaze, scanning the spaces between the buttress roots that created corridors of deep shadows. Max, the tireless scout, was visibly on high alert. The dog didn't just walk. He processed the environment in layers. His ears moved constantly, capturing the snapping of branches hundreds of meters away and the hum of insects Marcus couldn't even see. His left ear, marked by the notch that witnessed his survival in past battles, was always turned toward Elena's flank, fulfilling the silent order of protection. Suddenly the German Shepherd stopped. It wasn't a sudden stop of someone encountering an immediate threat, but a calculated hesitation. He lowered his snout to the ground, his nostrils dilating rhythmically, and then raised his head to the air, sniffing something that didn't belong to that ecosystem. Marcus froze in the same instant, signaling with an open palm for Elena to stop behind him. The silence that followed was absolute, an absence of sound so deep that Marcus could hear the hum of his own nervous system and the accelerated heartbeat of the woman at his back. Marcus said in a whisper that seemed to be absorbed by the moss on the trees, "Don't move. Max has detected something. The wind is blowing from the north, which means whatever he's feeling is right ahead of us, hidden by the slope of the terrain. Keep your eyes on our six, Elena. If I go down, you do the same." Elena replied, her voice trembling but controlled. "I don't see anything, Marcus. All I see are trees and shadows. What is Max feeling? Could it be a large animal?" Marcus said, keeping his eyes fixed on the dog. "Max knows the smell of the jaguar, the tapir, and the wild boar. He wouldn't react like this for an animal. What he's feeling smells like metal, oil, or human sweat. Something that shouldn't be here. Stay silent." Marcus took a few cautious steps toward Max and crouched beside the dog. He observed the direction of the animal's gaze, which pointed toward a tangle of vines and low-growing palms about 20 meters away. The veteran pulled a small thermal imaging monocular from his vest pocket and scanned the area. The screen revealed only the residual heat of the plants and the thermal trail of a small rodent, but nothing indicating the presence of a large body. However, his intuition, forged in years of operations in slums and border forests, told him Max was right. He stood up slowly and took his tactical compass from the accessory holder. That was when he noticed the first technical anomaly. The compass needle, which should have been pointing firmly toward magnetic north, began to spin erratically, oscillating from side to side as if under the influence of a powerful and invisible magnet. Every shadow in the forest seemed to lengthen, the silence of the dawn stretching until it became a physical weight upon his shoulders. He felt the grip of his weapon, the cold steel a reminder of the reality he had chosen. They were far from the cabin now, far from the safety of the known world. Ahead, the path of stars beckoned, its secrets guarded by the very earth itself. Max remained a sentinel, his body tense and ready, a mirror of the man beside him. Elena, her breath hitching in the cold air, waited for the next command, her trust now solely in the hands of the soldier and his dog. They were three souls against the infinite green, moving through the weight of silence towards a fate that had been waiting for them for 20 long years. The journey was no longer just a trek through the jungle. It was a descent into the forgotten history of a man who had taught Marcus everything he knew about death and survival. The forest seemed to acknowledge their presence, the leaves whispering secrets that only the wind could understand. Marcus adjusted his pack, the weight of it a familiar companion, and prepared to face whatever the shadows were hiding. The silence was absolute, but the mission was loud in his mind. They would find the Colonel. They would find the truth, or they would be swallowed by the green immensity that knows neither mercy nor regret. The path was set, the stars were watching, and the sentinel was moving deeper into the heart of the mystery. The morning had truly begun, and with it, the struggle for redemption in the most beautiful and terrifying place on Earth. He signaled to Elena to stay low as they skirted the magnetic anomaly, his mind already calculating the next tactical move. They were no longer just walking. They were hunting for the truth, and the hunt had only just begun. The weight of silence was their ally and their enemy, a double-edged sword in the hands of a man who had forgotten how to live, but knew exactly how to fight. The Amazon was waiting, and Marcus was ready. The ascent toward the highlands of the reserve began to extract a physical price that the suffocating humidity of the lowlands had only hinted at. As the group pushed deeper into what Marcus recognized as the heart of the primary forest, the vegetation underwent a subtle yet ominous transformation, becoming taller, darker, and infinitely more silent. Here, The ceiba trees and ironwoods rose like the colossal pillars of a forgotten Gothic cathedral, their canopies so dense that the light of the sun, even at the peak of noon, was filtered into spectral beams of a sickly emerald hue. The ground, carpeted by an ancient spongy layer of leaf litter that never truly dried, muffled the sound of their tactical boots, turning their march into a ghostly, soundless displacement through the undergrowth. Marcus felt the sweat trickling beneath his ceramic plate carrier, a salty stinging trail that irritated his skin and pooled at the base of his spine. But he allowed no sign of discomfort to alter his rigid, disciplined posture. He walked with his knees slightly bent to lower his center of gravity, his weight distributed with practiced ease to ensure that any sudden movement could be converted into a lethal defensive reaction in a heartbeat. His 12-gauge shotgun rested in his arms like a natural extension of his own muscular frame, the barrel tracking in perfect synchronization with his gaze as he scanned the dark corridors of shadows created by the massive buttress roots. Max, the tireless and highly trained military working dog, was visibly operating on a plane of heightened alert. He didn't merely walk through the brush. He processed the environment in distinct, high-fidelity layers of information. His ears moved in a constant, independent swivel, capturing the distant snapping of dry branches hundreds of meters away and the low-frequency hum of insects that Marcus's human ears could not even begin to perceive. His notched left ear, the jagged witness to his survival in past combat deployments, was perpetually turned toward Elena's flank, fulfilling Marcus's silent directive of protection with a devotion that bordered on the supernatural. Suddenly, the Sable German Shepherd came to a dead halt. It wasn't the abrupt stop of an animal encountering an immediate predatory threat, but rather a calculated, investigative hesitation. He lowered his snout toward the dark soil, his nostrils dilating in a rapid, rhythmic cadence, and then he raised his head into the stagnant air, catching the scent of something that did not belong to this ancient ecosystem. Marcus froze in the exact same millisecond, signaling with a flat, open palm for Elena to stop dead in her tracks behind him. The silence that followed was absolute, an absence of sound so profound that Marcus could hear the electric hum of his own nervous system and the frantic, drum-like heartbeat of the woman standing just inches from his back. Marcus said, in a whisper that seemed to be instantly absorbed by the thick moss coating the surrounding trunks, "Do not move an inch. Max has picked up a scent. The wind is shifting from the north, which means whatever he's alerting to is directly ahead of us, likely hidden by the natural incline of this ridge. Keep your eyes on our 6, Elena. If I drop to a low profile, you do exactly the same without question." Elena replied, her voice trembling with the cold dampness, but remaining controlled under the pressure. "I can't see anything, Marcus. It's just endless trees and shifting shadows." "What exactly is Max picking up? Could it be a jaguar or something larger?" Marcus said, his eyes never leaving the rigid form of the dog. "Max is familiar with the scent profile of every predator in this jungle, from the jaguar to the peccary. He wouldn't react with this kind of focused intensity for a local animal. What he's catching smells of oxidized metal, old gun oil, or human sweat. Elements that have no business being this deep in the primary forest. Stay silent and wait for my lead." Marcus took a few slow, agonizingly cautious steps toward Max and crouched beside the dog, placing a steadying hand on the animal's harness. He observed the precise direction of the dog's gaze, which was fixed on a dense tangle of lianas and low-growing palms approximately 20 meters ahead. The veteran reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small thermal imaging monocular, scanning the emerald wall for heat signatures. The screen revealed only the residual warmth of the vegetation and the frantic thermal trail of a small rodent scurrying through the roots, but nothing that suggested a large, warm-blooded body. However, his combat intuition, forged in the fires of Tier 1 operations and the unforgiving border forests, told him that Max was not mistaken. He stood up slowly and withdrew his tactical compass from its dedicated pouch on his belt. It was then that he noticed the first severe technical anomaly of the mission. The compass needle, which should have been locked firmly onto magnetic north, was spinning in erratic, violent circles, oscillating from side to side as if it were being manipulated by a powerful, invisible magnetic field deep within the earth. Marcus said, stowing the useless instrument with a grim, hardened expression. The compass is dead. We've just crossed into a massive magnetic anomaly zone. The soil here must be saturated with magnetite or some other ferrous mineral that's scrambling the electronics. From this point forward, we are navigating purely on instinct, terrain association, and the dog's internal GPS. Elena, take a hydration break. We're going to perform a 5-minute tactical halt under the cover of this SEBA. I need the truth about that photograph, and I need it now. They settled themselves between the massive, wing-like roots of a giant tree, which served as a natural fortification against any lateral observation. Elena pulled her canteen from her pack and took small, measured sips, while the humidity began to wash away the grime on her pale skin in streaks. Marcus sat directly across from her, his shotgun resting across his knees, while Max took up a position at the mouth of their natural bunker, facing outward into the gloom. The environment felt claustrophobic, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and mold. Marcus fixed his hardened steel-gray eyes on Elena, searching for any sign of deception in her features. Marcus said, "That photo you showed me back at the cabin, the man in the center is Colonel Mendes. He was my commanding officer and my primary mentor in the teams. He was the man who taught me how to move through the world like a shadow. 20 years ago, we were sent on an extraction op that went south in a heartbeat. I watched his bird take a direct hit and vanish into the canopy. We searched for months and never found so much as a piece of debris. Why do you have that photo now? And how can you possibly know he's alive in a place that shouldn't exist?" Elena lowered her head for a moment, her fingers tightening around the cold metal of her canteen. When she finally looked back up at Marcus, there was a profound sadness in her eyes, mixed with a desperate urgency that seemed to burn with a feverish light. She appeared to be weighing every syllable, knowing that the trust of the man sitting across from her was the only thing standing between her and a lonely death in the green vastness. Elena replied, "Mendes is my father, Marcus. I grew up being told he was a hero who died in the line of duty, but my mother never fully accepted that narrative. Before she passed away 2 years ago, she gave me a bundle of letters she had been receiving periodically, letters mailed from various small towns across the Amazon, with no return address, but written in a code that only she and my father shared. In those letters, he spoke of a place where time didn't follow the rules of the outside world, a sanctuary hidden by what he called celestial geometries. He specifically mentioned the path of stars as the only way in. I spent my entire inheritance and the last 2 years of my life hiring mercenaries and guides, but they all deserted me, or died, before we got anywhere near these coordinates. You are my last hope, Marcus. I'm not here for the gold in that briefcase, or for any political agenda. I'm here to bring my father home, or at the very least, to find out why he never came back to us." Marcus listened to the confession without breaking eye contact. The revelation that she was Mendes's daughter shifted the entire emotional and tactical weight of the mission. The deep-seated respect he held for his old mentor was now transformed into a moral obligation toward the woman sitting in the mud before him. But the mention of the letters and celestial geometries sounded like the ramblings of a man lost to isolation, or perhaps a high-level military secret he had never been cleared to know. He was well aware that the military had conducted numerous black-budget projects in this region during the Cold War, but nothing that would justify a man remaining hidden for 2 decades. Marcus said, "Mendes was a pragmatist to his core. He didn't speak in riddles. If he mentioned the path of stars, he was referring to a physical route or a specific non-electronic navigation system. The problem is, without a compass, we're flying blind. If Max is picking up unnatural scents, it means your father might not be the only inhabitant of these coordinates. There are legends about deserters and rogue units who vanished into the bush and established their own rules. If they're shadowing us, they already know we're here." Elena shivered, casting an apprehensive glance into the darkness beyond the roots. The silence of the forest, now felt far more predatory, as if every trunk were a silent observer to their conversation. Max let out a short, sharp breath through his nostrils, a sign of impatience, or perhaps a warning that the scent he had detected earlier was lingering in the shifting air. The dog remained tense, his muscles coiled and ready for immediate action. Elena replied, "Do you think they could be watching us right now? I haven't heard a single thing, and Max hasn't barked," Marcus said, as he stood up and tightened the load-bearing straps on his rucksack. "In the Amazon, the enemy you hear is the one who's already lost the tactical edge. The real danger is the silence. Look at the birds and the monkeys in the canopy. When we first entered this sector, they should have been making a hell of a noise, defending their territory from intruders. But notice how they went dead quiet minutes before we reached this tree. There's an acoustic vacuum around us. Someone or something is moving on our flanks, parallel to our trail, maintaining the exact same distance. They aren't trying to stop us yet, Elena. They're herding us. They're letting us move deeper into the kill zone." The realization that they were being systematically herded by the forest itself made Elena stand up quickly, adrenaline momentarily overriding her profound exhaustion. Marcus handed her a small bottle of high-potency repellent and signaled for her to apply it to her neck and wrists. He knew that the human scent profile was their greatest tactical weakness in the bush. He then called Max over with a silent snap of his fingers, and the dog approached, allowing Marcus to verify the security of the side pouches on his harness. Marcus said to Max, his voice a mere thread of sound in the humid air, "Find the cold trail, Max. Show me where they're stepping without letting them realize we're onto them." The dog tilted his head, processing the complex command. He began to move in a different pattern now, no longer acting as a forward scout, but as a counter-tracker, searching for the minute flaws in the enemy's camouflage. They resumed the march, but Marcus began to avoid the obvious trails and open spaces. He started to weave between the thickest trunks, using the natural geometry of the forest to break the line of sight of whoever was shadowing them from the flanks. Their progress was excruciatingly slow. Every step was a careful negotiation with the uneven ground. Every branch moved out of the way was done with the delicacy of a man diffusing a landmine in the dark. The humidity seemed to intensify as they climbed higher, turning their sweat into a sticky, suffocating layer that made every movement feel like a struggle against the air itself. The smell of the primary forest was intoxicating, a heavy blend of exotic orchids that only bloomed in the deep shade, and the sickly sweet odor of decaying organic matter. As they moved, Marcus noticed something on the trunk of a black cinnamon tree. He stopped and leaned in to examine the bark. There was a precise, deliberate notch cut into the wood, an incision made by a steel blade, not the teeth of an animal. The cut was darkened by age, suggesting it had been made months or even years ago, but the way the tree had healed told a story of deliberate human intervention. The notch formed a small, crude arrow pointing upward toward the misty ridges. Marcus said, pointing to the mark so Elena could see, "That's not the mark of a rubber tapper or a local tribesman. That's a military trail marker. Your father, or whoever he's with, has been leaving breadcrumbs for a long time. The path of stars is starting to reveal itself, but the price of following it is going up by the hour. Max, what have you got?" The dog was standing a few meters ahead, positioned in front of a small, dry gully that served as a natural drainage channel for the heavy rains. Max wasn't sniffing the ground. He was focused on a small piece of synthetic fabric that had become snagged on a thorn bush. Marcus approached and retrieved the fragment with the tip of his knife. It was a piece of nylon ripstop fabric in an old-school tiger stripe camouflage pattern, the exact same material used in special operations uniforms 20 years ago. The fabric was weathered, but it wasn't rotten. Someone had passed through here recently wearing the clothes of a past that should have been buried. The feeling of being watched became almost unbearable. Marcus could feel the unseen eyes of the forest pressing against the back of his neck. He knew that somewhere in that emerald immensity, Colonel Mendes, or what was left of him, was waiting. But he also knew that the path of stars could be a final trap, a last test of loyalty and survival designed to weed out the unworthy. He looked at Max, whose tail was held low and tense, and then at Elena, whose sheer determination seemed to be the only thing keeping her from a total physical collapse. Their journey was entering a phase where traditional military logic began to fail, replaced by a reality where the forest itself seemed to possess a hostile, sentient consciousness. The march was no longer just a physical effort, it was a psychological endurance test. The slow pace was now a survival necessity, as one wrong step would not only trigger a trap, but reveal their exact position to the ghosts that surrounded them. Marcus tightened his grip on the shotgun and continued to push forward, feeling the weight of the indigenous seed necklace on his wrist like a talisman against the encroaching darkness. They pushed on for several more hours, ascending a slope where the soil was composed of a slick, red clay that defied the traction of their tactical boots. The physical effort was Herculean. Marcus could feel his leg muscles screaming under the strain, but he maintained a steady, rhythmic pace, helping Elena through the most treacherous sections of the climb. Max, despite his superior endurance, was also showing signs of the toll the terrain was taking, his breathing becoming heavier, though his vigilance never wavered for a single second. The air was thinning as they gained altitude, and the biting cold began to seep through the humidity, creating a sense of thermal discomfort that tested the group's patience. Finally, they reached a small natural plateau, a ledge on the side of the mountain that offered a limited panoramic view of the vast green sea below. The mist had cleared just enough to allow them to see the undulating carpet of trees stretching toward the horizon, a sight of terrifying and majestic beauty. It was here that Marcus decided they would make camp for the night. They needed shelter, and they needed a fire, even if the smoke was a tactical risk. At this altitude, hypothermia was an enemy just as lethal as any hidden guerrilla fighter. Marcus said, as he began to clear a small patch of ground for the bivouac, "We stop here for the night. We can't push any higher in the dark with the ground in this condition. Max, sweep the perimeter for threats. Elena, look for dry wood sheltered under the fallen trunks. We're going to need a small, highly concealed fire. The night up here is unforgiving to those who aren't prepared." Elena nodded, her movements stiff with extreme physical exhaustion. She began to collect small twigs while Marcus set up a jungle hammock with a rainfly, positioning it between two thick-trunked trees that offered natural protection from the rising wind. He worked in total silence, his movements a choreographed display of efficiency and caution. Max circled the plateau, marking the territory and ensuring there were no immediate intruders lurking in the shadows. The dog seemed calmer in the more open environment, but his eyes never stopped scanning the tree line with an intensity that chilled the blood. As the absolute darkness of the Amazonian night fell over them, bringing with it a completely different set of sounds, the eerie hooting of owls and the deep, guttural croaking of giant toads, Marcus sat near the glowing embers of their hidden fire, which he had placed in a small hole in the ground to mask the light. He looked at his hands, stained with earth and the dried blood from minor scratches, and then at Elena, who was wrapped in her blanket on the opposite side of the fire. The path of stars was closer. He could feel it in the subtle vibration of the ground and the erratic behavior of his tactical gear. But he also knew that the true trial was yet to come. The silence of the primary forest was merely a prelude, a deep breath before the scream.
And Marcus, the sentinel, knew he would need every ounce of his experience and the unwavering loyalty of Max to survive whatever was waiting for them at the top of that forgotten mountain. The night deepened, and with it came the sensation that the stars, though hidden by the thick clouds, were indeed watching them from above. Marcus checked his weapon one last time, feeling the cold, reassuring metal against his palm.
He looked at Max, who was sleeping with one eye open, and then out into the absolute darkness of the surrounding forest. They were alone, yet surrounded by memories and threats. The journey into the unknown would continue at first light, but for now, the only objective was to survive the weight of the silence and the biting cold of the mountain. They were camped on the edge of the abyss, waiting for the path of stars to reveal itself, not as a grave, but as a way out of a past that refused to stay dead. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment of tactical rest, his hand resting on Max's shoulder, feeling the steady, powerful heartbeat of his partner. They were the sentinels of this forgotten place, and the mission was far from over. In the quiet of the high Amazon, the stars were beginning to align, even if they couldn't see them yet. Marcus breathed in the cold, thin air and prepared himself for the final climb. The jungle was waiting, and tomorrow, the truth would finally be exhumed from the green heart of the world. He felt the weight of the old rosary in his pack, a secret piece of gear he had never told anyone about, and knew that he was ready for whatever the path of stars had in store. The sentinel was prepared, and the mission would be completed, regardless of the cost. The silence of the night was his ally now, a blanket of protection in a world of shadows. He would wake before the sun, and the march would begin again. The path was there, invisible but absolute, and he would follow it to the very end. He adjusted his position, feeling the hard ground beneath him, and let the sounds of the night wash over him. He was a soldier of the shadows, and in the darkness, he found his true purpose. The stars were waiting, and so was the colonel, and Marcus would not fail them. The silence of the mountain was the only answer he needed. He was home. He was in the fight, and that was enough. The pre-dawn hours on the high plateau were not a time for rest, but rather a final, grueling test of physical and mental endurance. The cold at this altitude was a sharp, predatory presence, an unexpected intruder in the heart of the Amazon that seeped through Marcus's tactical layers, seeking out every joint and every pore to steal the warmth from his body. He did not allow the involuntary shiver to take hold of his muscles. Instead, he used the biting chill as a constant, razor-sharp reminder that vigilance was his only true armor. The silence of that dead hour, between 4 and 5 in the morning, was absolute and heavy, broken only by the rhythmic dripping of condensation forming on the rainfly of his hammock and falling onto the saturated earth below. Marcus opened his eyes long before the first hint of grey light. He had no need for alarms. His biological clock, calibrated by decades of deployments, where time was measured by the cadence of patrols and the rotation of watches, woke him with the precision of a stopwatch. He felt the reassuring, heavy weight of Max, leaning against the base of the tree where his hammock was anchored. The dog, though appearing to sleep, kept his ears in constant, independent motion, processing the subsonic shifts of the forest as it prepared for the transition from the nocturnal domain to the awakening day. Marcus began the silent, methodical process of dismantling the bivouac. He moved with an economy of gesture that bordered on a rehearsed, choreographic perfection. Every length of paracord he released was coiled and stowed so that it made not a single sound of friction against the nylon. He avoided the use of flashlights. His hands, guided by muscle memory and a peripheral vision adjusted to the deep gloom, operated the buckles and the tensioners with a somber naturalness. His objective was ghosting, the Tier 1 technique of leaving absolutely no trace of his presence. He extinguished the cold ashes of the small fire, which were already damp from the mist, burying them deep beneath the soil and covering the area with fresh leaf litter, meticulously mimicking the natural pattern of the forest floor. He knew that for an experienced tracker, nothing is ever truly invisible, but he would make the task for whoever was following them as difficult and frustrating as possible. He approached Elena, who was still wrapped tightly in her blanket, curled against the biting cold. Her face, even under the strain of exhaustion and the grime of the trail, maintained a nobility that Marcus found both intriguing and dangerously distracting. He touched her shoulder lightly, applying only enough pressure to wake her without causing a startle reflex that might lead to a shout or a sudden movement. Elena opened her eyes instantly, the flicker of raw fear giving way to a grim understanding when she saw Marcus's silhouette looming over her in the half-light. Marcus said, in a whisper that was little more than a breath of warm air against the morning chill, "It's time to move. The cold is our enemy for now, but the sun will bring the humidity back with a vengeance. Eat a protein bar and take a long drink of water. We need to clear this plateau before the light reveals our position to anyone watching from the valleys below." Elena nodded, sitting up with visible difficulty. Her movements were stiff, betraying the deep muscular pain that the previous day's steep climb had inflicted upon her. She accepted the ration Marcus handed her and began to chew mechanically, her eyes fixed on the darkness of the woods that surrounded them. She seemed to be absorbing the gravity of the location, the growing sense that they were in a territory where the laws of civilization held no jurisdiction and where the forest itself was the judge and executioner. Elena said, her voice raspy and thin from the cold, "I had a dream, Marcus. I saw my father walking on lights that sprouted from the ground. He didn't look back. He seemed to be guided by something I couldn't quite see." "Do you think we're close? Or is the jungle just starting to play tricks on my mind?" Marcus replied, as he finished adjusting the tension on Max's tactical harness. "Dreams are just your brain's way of trying to organize the stress of the mission, Elena. However, your intuition about the lights might not be entirely off. The magnetic anomaly we saw yesterday suggests rare mineral deposits. Under these specific conditions, at this altitude and with this level of humidity, bioluminescence is a common biological reaction. If your father used that to navigate, he was smarter and more resourceful than I already gave him credit for. But don't trust dreams. Trust where you put your feet. Let's move." They resumed the march while the forest was still submerged in a deep, purplish darkness. Max led the group, but his posture was markedly different now. The dog wasn't just acting as a scout. He seemed to be tracking an invisible pattern. As they descended into a lateral valley, where the vegetation became sparser and the soil consisted of outcrops of black, porous rock, something extraordinary began to manifest. Beneath the canopy of the giant trees, the forest floor began to emit a faint, pulsating glow. It wasn't an artificial light, but a bioluminescence originating from massive colonies of fungi and mosses that reacted to the specific pressure and chemical composition of the magnetite-laden soil. The glow was a deep, spectral blue-green, creating points of light that connected through the exposed roots, forming patterns that, to an untrained observer, would have appeared random or chaotic. But Marcus, observing from a tactical and navigational perspective, realized the hidden geometry. The lights were not everywhere. They followed the veins of minerals cutting through the slope, creating a luminous trail that wound toward the peak of the ridge. It was, quite literally, the path of stars. The lights on the ground mirrored the constellations that should have been in the sky, had the thick clouds not been obscuring them. It was a natural, secret navigation system, accessible only to someone who knew the geological secret of this unique environment. Elena said, her voice filled with wonder, her eyes shimmering with tears as she witnessed the spectral beauty of the trail. "This is it, Marcus. It's exactly as he described it in the letters. The stars that fell to earth. We're on his trail. He really passed through here, through this exact valley," Marcus said, maintaining his vigilance and refusing to be seduced by the beauty of the phenomenon. "Keep your focus, Elena. The light that guides us also reveals our silhouettes to anyone in the high ground. Do not step directly on the light clusters. The glow intensifies with pressure. Follow Max. He's using the shadows between the glowing points to mask our movement." The progress was slow and nearly oniric. They walked over a celestial map drawn in mud and rock. The feeling of being in another world was reinforced by the sepulchral silence of that altitude. The sound of Marcus's boots on the porous stone was a dry, brittle noise, like the snapping of old bones. Max moved with extreme caution, his paws touching the ground with the lightness of a feline, his eyes capturing the rhythmic variations of the bioluminescent pulse. The dog seemed to understand that this light was a border marker, a dividing line between the common jungle and the forbidden sanctuary they were seeking. After 2 hours of steady climbing through that sea of ghostly lights, the path of stars led them to a natural clearing that should not have existed in that topography. In the center of the clearing rose a structure that looked like an architectural hallucination. It was an old observation and communications outpost, a tower of metal and concrete that had likely been built in the late 70s or early 80s. The structure was now completely swallowed by ficus roots and giant vines, transforming what had once been a piece of military engineering into a monument of organic decay. The parabolic antennas, now rusted and covered in thick moss, looked like great iron flowers that had never bloomed. Marcus signaled for Elena to stay protected behind the massive trunk of a fallen jacaranda. He approached the structure with his shotgun in a ready position, every sense operating at the limit of perception. Max moved ahead, his snout pressed against the cracked concrete. The dog didn't growl, which indicated there was no immediate human threat inside, but he stopped at the entrance to the tower and emitted a low, melancholy whine that made Marcus feel a cold shiver at the base of his neck. Marcus said, "Elena, stay where you are until I give you the green light." Max sensed something in there that isn't a threat, but it's important. "I'm going to perform a tactical sweep. Keep your eyes on the tree line." Marcus entered the base of the tower. The interior smelled of oxidized metal, mold, and the sharp, acrid scent of bat guano. The floor was covered with the wreckage of electronic equipment from another era. Transistors, rubber-coated cables that had turned to rot, and control panels whose needle gauges were frozen in emergency positions. The bluish light from the exterior penetrated through the cracks in the concrete, creating an atmosphere reminiscent of a horror film. In the center of the main room, on a metal table that had resisted the ravages of time, Max was standing, his front paws resting on the surface. Before the dog lay a small shortwave radio, a robust military model. But what caught Marcus's attention was not the gear. Beside the radio was an aluminum canteen identical to the one Mendes wore in the photograph, and attached to it was a small wooden rosary, its beads worn smooth by constant use. Marcus picked up the rosary with the tips of his fingers. He recognized the object instantly. Mendes had carried it on every mission, saying it was his insurance against hell. The fact that the object was here, displayed in a nearly deliberate manner, suggested that Mendes, or whoever was occupying this place, wanted to be found, or that this was his final message to the world. Marcus said, as Elena entered the tower, ignoring the order to wait, drawn by Marcus's sudden silence. "Look at this. It's his rosary. Mendes was here. And by the look of this radio, someone has been performing basic maintenance on the internal circuits. This place isn't abandoned, Elena. It's being used as a relay station. Someone is sending signals out from here, even now." Elena grabbed the canteen, hugging it against her chest, as tears fell onto the cold metal. Her father's presence was now almost physical in that cramped, history-laden space. She looked at the control panels, at the wires that Marcus now noticed had been patched with electrical tape and natural forest resin. Elena replied, her voice breaking, "He's alive, Marcus. He turned this ruin into his world. But why didn't he leave? Why stay here sending signals if no one ever answered him? Why choose this tomb over us?" Marcus said, observing the sketches drawn with chalk on the concrete walls. Maybe he wasn't sending signals to be rescued. Maybe he was monitoring something else. Look at these markings, their flight coordinates and satellite pass schedules. Mendes wasn't just surviving. He was watching the sky. He was protecting the path of stars from something coming from above, or perhaps waiting for something to return. The understanding of the magnitude of Mendes's obsession began to weigh heavily on Marcus. He saw now that his mentor was not just a castaway of war, but a self-proclaimed sentinel guarding a secret the forest had decided to hide. However, the feeling of being watched that had accompanied him since the cabin reached its absolute peak at that moment. Max, who had been relatively calm, suddenly spun on his paws, facing the entrance of the tower. His ears were pinned back against his skull, and a deep, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate from the depths of the earth rumbled in his throat. Marcus said, instantly shifting into combat mode and pushing Elena behind a rack of old servers. "Get down. Max has visual contact. Someone is in the clearing. We are not alone anymore." Marcus positioned himself near the crack in the steel door, using the shadow of the concrete to hide the glint of his skin and the metal of his weapon. He observed the edge of the woods through the mist that was now beginning to rise with the heat of the newborn sun. Initially, he saw nothing but the swaying of the leaves, but then he saw the shadow that moves against the wind. It was an advanced camouflage technique, where the individual moves in perfect synchronization with the sway of the vegetation. It wasn't a local tribe, nor an animal. It was a trained operator. Marcus said, keeping his voice calm and focused, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "We have company. At least 2 men on the flanks, and 1 moving through the center. They're wearing ghillie suits made of natural forest fibers. These aren't amateurs. They're closing in on us in a pincer movement. They've been waiting for us to reach the relay," Elena replied, her tone of voice bordering on silent panic. "Is it them? The people who want to erase what my father left behind? Are they the ones who took him?" Marcus said, "I don't know who they are, but they're making the same mistake many others have. They think I'm just a guide. Max, get ready for the left flank. On my signal, you create the distraction. Elena, if the shooting starts, you crawl to the back of the tower where there's a ventilation duct. Do not come out until I tell you it's clear." Marcus felt the weight of the silence transform into an unbearable physical pressure. He didn't want to initiate combat. Under these conditions, the element of surprise was his only real advantage. He decided to use a counterintelligence technique Mendes had taught him years ago. He pulled out a small signaling mirror and positioned it so it reflected a beam of light to a distant point in the clearing, far from his actual position. The momentary glint caught the attention of one of the attackers. Marcus saw the barrel of a weapon with a noise suppressor emerge from the foliage 30 meters away. Marcus said, in a tone loud enough to be heard outside, but without revealing his exact location, "I know you're out there, Mendes, or whoever you trained to hunt like you. I didn't come here to destroy this place. I brought your daughter. If you fire, you kill your own blood. Look at her face before you pull that trigger." The silence that followed Marcus's proclamation was so tense, it felt as if the forest itself had held its breath. Max's growling stopped, replaced by a controlled, heavy breathing. Marcus kept his finger lightly against the trigger, his mind calculating the shot trajectories. Suddenly, the figure in the center of the clearing stood up. It wasn't a modern ghillie suit. It was a garment made of animal skins and old fishing nets, interwoven with living moss. The man was tall, but bent by the passage of time, and he held an automatic rifle that looked like a museum relic, yet was perfectly maintained and oiled. The man said with a voice that sounded like it came from a tomb, raspy and unaccustomed to human speech, "Marcus, the officer who left his own behind in the mud? You took 20 years to find the way back. Why should I believe this woman is my daughter, and not another trap from the ones who keep trying to silence the sky?" Elena, upon hearing the voice, could not contain herself. She broke away from behind the server rack and ran toward the door, even though Marcus tried to hold her back. She stopped in the threshold, the light of the rising sun illuminating her face, which was bathed in tears and sweat. Elena said, screaming with all the strength in her lungs, "Father, it's me, Elena. I have the letters. I have the photograph you took with my mother in the mountains. Please put the weapon down. We came to bring you home." The man in the clearing hesitated. The weapon in his hands wavered. Marcus remained ready to intervene, but he saw the shift in the stranger's body language. The aggression gave way to a profound, soul-deep vulnerability. The man pulled back the moss hood, revealing a face that was a map of scars and deep wrinkles, with eyes that shone with a terrifying lucidity beneath thick, white eyebrows. It was Colonel Mendes, or what the Amazon had allowed to remain of him. Mendes said, lowering the rifle and falling to his knees in the bioluminescent mud, "Elena, you are the living image of your mother. The path of stars finally brought the peace I never deserved to find. You shouldn't have come to this place, but God help me, I'm glad you did." Marcus lowered the shotgun, feeling an immense weight lifted from his shoulders, but he did not relax entirely. Max approached Mendes with caution, sniffing the man and finally wagging his tail in a sign of ancestral recognition. The reunion was the emotional climax of the journey, but Marcus knew that Mendes's presence there, watching the sky and the earth, indicated that the real danger had not ended with that embrace. The path of stars was a gateway, and they had just crossed the portal into a reality where survival would require much more than traditional military tactics. Marcus said, approaching Mendes and helping him to his feet, "Colonel, it's good to see you're still at your post, but we have little time. If I manage to get here, others will too. The signal you've been sending out has attracted some very unwanted attention. We need to secure this perimeter and get moving before the real hunters arrive. Mendes replied, looking up at the sky, which was now clear of clouds, revealing the vastness of the universe above them. The signal wasn't to attract you, Marcus. It was to keep what's up there away from what we buried down here. The path of stars is a shield, and it's failing. Now that you're here, the mission has changed. We're no longer on a rescue, we're on a containment operation. And the world is not ready for what happens if we fail. Marcus looked at Max, then at Elena and Mendes. The block ended with the group's reunion, but the feeling that the geometry of the forest was about to collapse was evident. They were at the center of the mystery, surrounded by lights that mirrored the sky and by shadows that carried secrets of 2 decades. The contemplative journey had given way to a high-stakes tactical reality. The path of stars was not the end. It was only the beginning of a new and terrible chapter in the life of the sentinel of the jungle. He felt the cold of the morning being replaced by the scorching heat of the tropical sun. But in his soul, he knew the true storm was only beginning to form on the celestial horizon. He shook Mendes's hand, his mentor and ghost, and prepared for what would come next. The forest, in its cruel wisdom, had brought them there to face the truth. And the truth was something no briefcase of gold or military training could ever fully prepare a man to accept. Marcus looked at the tower shrouded in roots, no longer a ruin, but the final bastion of a war the world thought had ended, but which in these coordinates had never ceased to exist. He felt the weight of his duty, the silent promise made to the dead and the living, and knew that the march into the heart of the secret was just beginning. Max stood by his side, a silent witness to the collision of past and present, ready for the next command. The path of stars was lit, and the way forward was clear, however dangerous it might be. Marcus breathed in the humid air and steeled his heart. The sentinel was ready for the containment, and the jungle would be his witness. The descent into the subterranean levels of the observation tower was a transition between 2 entirely distinct worlds, a slow plunge from the chaotic, emerald exuberance of the Amazonian rainforest into the cold, sterile and ossified rigidity of a military era that the rest of the world had long since forgotten. Colonel Mendes led the way, moving with a silent, fluid agility that defied his weathered, hermit-like appearance, guiding them toward a heavy steel hatch that had been meticulously camouflaged beneath a thick layer of forest debris and desiccated moss. As they descended the iron rungs, which were oxidized with age but still structurally sound, the scent of damp earth and decaying vegetation was gradually replaced by a sharp, acrid odor of ozone, stagnant dust, and the lingering chemical perfume of ancient hydraulic fluids. The temperature dropped with every meter they moved downward, and the humidity that had previously weighed upon Marcus's shoulders now transformed into a biting, subterranean chill that seemed to emanate directly from the raw concrete walls. Marcus kept his shotgun held in a low-ready position, his eyes constantly scanning the deepening shadows where the darkness seemed to take on a life of its own under the erratic, flickering glow of the kerosene lamp Mendes carried. Max followed closely behind his handler, his claws emitting a series of sharp, dry sounds as they met the metal of the stairs. His neck muscles tensed, and his nostrils flared as he processed a complex inventory of scents that civilization had ceased to produce decades ago. The bunker that finally revealed itself before them was a veritable time capsule, a sanctuary of analog technology and deep-state secrets that the outside world believed were safely buried under mountains of bureaucracy and decades of intentional neglect. Entire walls were occupied by massive control panels filled with bakelite switches, needle-driven gauges frozen in critical positions, and large reels of magnetic tape that looked like vast, dark eyes watching the intruders with a silent, mechanical judgment. In the center of the main room, a large glass-topped map table, illuminated from below by a flickering greenish fluorescent light, displayed the detailed topography of the surrounding region, marked with various symbols and annotations that Marcus recognized as the tactical codes for high-level exclusion zones. This place was far more than a simple hideout. It was the nerve center of a black-budget operation that had never officially received a name in the military's public archives, a silent sentinel that had spent decades watching things that human eyes were never meant to perceive. Colonel Mendes said, his voice echoing against the reinforced concrete walls with the somber gravity of a final confession. Welcome to the true heart of the Path of Stars. This facility was designed to monitor what global reconnaissance satellites couldn't capture through the permanent cloud cover of the Amazon basin. I was left here to be the caretaker of a truth that the government decided was too expensive to maintain, but far too dangerous to destroy. For 20 long years, I have been the only one to listen to the whisper of these machines, and to guard the darkness that hides beneath the roots of these ancient trees. Marcus walked toward one of the heavy steel filing cabinets, its drawers filled with leather-bound journals and manila folders that had been stained by time and moisture. He felt the immense weight of the silence in that bunker, a silence that seemed to be fueled by the low, distant hum of hidden generators that still provided a trickle of power to the facility. He looked over at Elena, who was standing motionless in the center of the room, her eyes fixed on a small, faded photograph of her mother that had been taped to one of the primary control panels, surrounded by complex mathematical equations and hand-drawn celestial diagrams. Marcus said, as he ran his calloused hand over the cold, metallic surface of a monitoring console. Colonel, are you telling me that you remained down here for 2 decades just to protect these files and these rusting machines? The military declared you dead. We mourned you as a fallen brother. Why didn't you ever send a signal out? Why didn't you request extraction when the official mission parameters were scrapped by the Pentagon? Colonel Mendes replied, turning to face his former subordinate with a gaze that was a haunting mixture of profound exhaustion and almost religious conviction. The mission was never scrapped, Marcus. It simply became invisible. What we are protecting here isn't just a collection of classified papers. It is the record of an event and a resource that would fundamentally shift the global balance of power if it ever fell into the wrong hands. The Path of Stars isn't just a biological trail of glowing fungi. It is a thermal and geological map of mineral deposits that shouldn't exist on this planet. A fuel source so potent that nations would burn this entire forest to the ground just to possess it. I stayed because I knew that if I left, the shadows that pursued us through the trees 20 years ago would come here and erase the final record. I became a ghost, so that the truth wouldn't become a corpse. Elena approached her father, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch his face. Yet she hesitated, as if she feared he might dissolve into smoke the moment she made contact. The tears she had been holding back during the grueling ascent of the mountain now flowed freely, carving clean paths through the grime and sweat on her cheeks. The internal conflict within her was palpable. The daughter who wanted to rescue her lost father was colliding with the woman who was beginning to understand the staggering burden he had chosen to carry. Elena said, her voice cracking under the immense weight of her emotion. Father, I don't care about rare minerals, military secrets, or the balance of global power. I came here for you. My mother died with your name on her lips. I have spent my entire life feeling like there was a hole in my soul, trying to fill the void that your absence left behind. You have fulfilled your duty. Let these machines die. Let the secret be reclaimed by the jungle. Please, come back with us. Marcus can get us out of here. He is the best operator I've ever met, just like you always said he was. Colonel Mendes closed his eyes for a long moment, and Marcus watched as the old soldier's shoulders sagged slightly, as if the weight of those 20 years was finally overcoming his rigid military posture. But when he opened his eyes again, there was no sign of surrender in them, only a deep-seated melancholy that seemed to stretch back through centuries. Colonel Mendes replied, reaching out to gently stroke Elena's hair with a hand that was weathered and scarred. I died on the day that helicopter went down, my daughter. The man you once knew lives only in your memories and in that old photograph. What is left of me belongs to this concrete, this damp air, and this secret. I cannot leave. If I exit this facility, the fail-safe system I installed will be disarmed by my inactivity, and they will have access to everything I have sacrificed my life to protect. My sacrifice only has value if I see it through to the very end. While the emotional tension reached its peak between father and daughter, Max, who had been quietly exploring the furthest corners of the bunker, stopped in front of a section of the wall that appeared to be nothing more than solid, featureless concrete. The dog began to dig frantically with his front paws against the base of the wall, emitting a low, insistent whine that immediately caught Marcus's tactical attention. The veteran knew that Max never made random movements. The dog's training was too ingrained for that. Marcus approached the animal and noticed a minute, almost invisible gap between two of the concrete blocks, from which a faint draft of air was escaping, air that smelled different from the stagnant dust of the rest of the bunker. It smelled of old, high-quality paper, but also of sandalwood and something deeply personal. Marcus said, signaling for the colonel to approach the wall. Max found something behind this panel. It looks like a hidden compartment that even you might not be monitoring, Colonel. What is hidden back here? Mendes looked at the wall with an expression of genuine surprise, a rare look for a man who believed he knew every square inch of his sanctuary. He approached the wall and, using a heavy metal pry bar he retrieved from a nearby tool rack, he forced the concrete block that Max had indicated. The block gave way with a sharp metallic grinding sound, revealing a small, dry niche carved into the inner wall. Inside, there were no military reports, no encryption keys, and no strategic maps. Instead, there was a small chest made of intricately carved dark wood, covered by a silk cloth that time had not managed to completely destroy. Marcus carefully retrieved the object and placed it on the glass surface of the map table. Elena and Colonel Mendes gathered around the table, their breath held as the wooden lid was slowly lifted. Inside the chest lay the object that Marcus realized was the true, inestimable discovery of their entire journey. It was not gold, it was not diamonds, and it was not the miraculous fuel source Mendes had described. It was hundreds of letters, written by hand on thin silk paper, tied together with ribbons of various colors. Beside the letters was a small metal music box and a series of detailed sketches drawn in lead pencil, depicting Elena at various stages of her childhood. Drawings based purely on the imagination of a father who had tried to visualize the growth of the daughter he had been forced to abandon. Marcus said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to express. You told her that the man she knew died in the crash, Colonel, but this chest tells a very different story. You spent 20 years writing letters you could never mail and drawing the life you were never allowed to have. This is the true path of stars. It is the trail of a man who never stopped loving, even while he was standing in the middle of hell. Elena picked up one of the drawings, which depicted her as a young woman, hauntingly similar to how she appeared now. Colonel Mendes fell into a profound silence, his hands trembling as he stared at the undeniable proof of his own preserved humanity. The rigid, military shell of the old soldier finally crumbled. He was no longer just the caretaker of a state secret. He was a father who had maintained his sanity through the love of a daughter he believed he would never see again. Colonel Mendes replied, his voice now nothing more than a broken, raspy whisper. I wrote every single night, when the hum of the machines became too loud to bear. I imagined what you would look like, Elena. I imagined your first steps, the sound of your voice, your triumphs and your sorrows. This chest was my anchor. It was the only thing that reminded me that I was still a man, and not just another component in the wiring of this bunker. The moment of profound redemption and emotional clarity was, however, brutally interrupted by a sharp, persistent electronic alarm that began to blare through the bunker's emergency speakers. On the primary control panels, a series of red warning lights began to flash in sync with the rapid pounding heartbeat Marcus now felt in his chest. Max immediately bolted to the base of the metal stairs, his ears pinned back, and a fierce, terrifying growl vibrating through his entire frame. Marcus said, instantly shifting back into the mindset of a Tier 1 combatant. We have a problem. The external perimeter of the tower has been breached. These aren't forest animals. The pressure sensors on the clearing are indicating multiple contacts moving in a coordinated tactical formation. They found us, Colonel. The time for talk is over. Colonel Mendes replied, his military authority returning as he snapped the wooden chest shut and handed it firmly to Elena. "It's the Shadow Hunters. They waited for someone to find the path so they could follow the trail directly to the core. They don't just want the secret. They want to erase any living witness who has seen this place. Marcus, take Elena and this chest through the secondary ventilation duct that exits on the north face of the mountain. I'm staying behind to initiate the final purge of the local archives," Elena said, clutching the wooden chest with one hand and her father's arm with the other. "No, I'm not leaving you here again. We just found each other. There has to be another way, a way for all of us to get out," Marcus said, rapidly evaluating their tactical options as the muffled sound of controlled explosions began to vibrate through the upper levels of the tower. "Colonel, you have already given 20 years of your life to this cold concrete. Now, you're going to give your life to actually watching your daughter grow up. I am not leaving you here to die for a collection of analog machines and old data. Max, check the duct. Elena, put that chest into my rucksack. We're going to fight our way out, and we're doing it together." The absolute determination in Marcus's voice allowed for no further argument. He knew that their exit would be a bloodbath if they didn't act with surgical speed and precision. He checked the load in his shotgun, feeling the weight of the slugs that were his final line of defense. He looked at Max, who was coiled like a spring at the foot of the stairs, and then at Colonel Mendes, who seemed to be weighing the chance of a real life against the ingrained duty of a lifetime. Colonel Mendes replied, drawing an old but impeccably maintained semi-automatic pistol from a holster beneath the desk. "You always were a stubborn officer, Marcus. If we're doing this, we're doing it my way. I know the blind spots of this mountain better than anyone alive. If we can reach the summit before their perimeter is fully established, we can use the cloud gap to signal for an extraction I prepared for an absolute emergency. But we will have to run, and Max will have to be our rearguard scout." They began to move toward the ventilation duct, a narrow, claustrophobic passage that would require them to crawl through the very heart of the mountain. Marcus led the way, clearing the path with his raw strength and his tactical flashlight, while Elena and the colonel followed close behind, protecting the chest of memories as if it were the last remaining scrap of light in a world of total darkness. Max remained at the mouth of the duct, watching the metal stairs where the enemy was about to emerge. The sound of the enemy's progress was now unmistakable, the rhythmic metallic thud of heavy boots on the stairs and the sharp clipped orders of men who were trained for extraction and elimination. Marcus felt the adrenaline burning in his veins, a cold, focused fire that transformed him once again into the combat machine he had tried so hard to forget. The jungle was waiting for them outside, indifferent to their struggle, ready to witness the final confrontation between the ghosts of the past and the warriors of the present. He looked back one last time, seeing Max's eyes glowing in the deep shadows, and he knew that the fight for redemption was about to enter its most violent and decisive phase. They crawled through the narrow duct, the metal groaning and creaking under their weight, while the heat from the overloaded generators made the air nearly unbearable to breathe. Marcus guided the group with a fierce, unrelenting determination, ignoring the deep scratches on his arms and the sweat that blurred his vision. He knew that time was their most precious resource, and that every inch gained in the duct was an inch closer to freedom, or perhaps to a final, inescapable trap. The fate of Elena, of Mendes, and of everything they had discovered now rested solely in the hands of the Sentinel and his loyal partner. The journey toward the inestimable discovery was complete, but the journey back toward life was just beginning, under the sound of the explosions that were now beginning to shake the very foundations of the observation tower. Marcus felt the weight of the chest in his pack, a weight that didn't burden him, but rather gave him a renewed sense of strength. He was no longer just protecting a stranger or following a ghost's trail. He was saving a family, and, in the process, he was saving himself from the darkness of his own isolation. The silence of the bunker had been shattered by violence, but the silence of Marcus's soul had been filled with a clear and undeniable purpose. He squeezed Elena's hand in a quick, encouraging gesture and continued to push forward, 1 inch at a time, through the darkness that promised the light of the stars at the end of the trail. With every movement, the group moved further away from the analog sanctuary, leaving behind the military records, but carrying with them the only proof that love can survive even in the most isolated and forgotten corners of the earth. The circle was closing, the shadow hunters were near, and the mountain itself seemed to groan under the stress of the impending conflict. The silence was gone, replaced by the roar of an ending era, and Marcus, the sentinel, was ready to face whatever came next. He gripped the handle of his weapon, his eyes fixed on the sliver of grey light ahead, and prepared to step out into the final battle for the path of stars. The mission was clear: survive, protect, and bring the ghost back to the world of the living. Max let out a low, vibrant growl of readiness, and together they pushed out into the cold, misty air of the mountainside. The end was near, but for Marcus and Max, it was only the beginning of the final reckoning. He could feel the pulse of the jungle outside, a wild and ancient heart that beat in time with his own. They were the shadows of the forest now, and the forest would be their witness as they fought for the right to finally leave the darkness behind. The path of stars was lit, not by fungi or minerals, but by the fire of a promise kept, and Marcus would not stop until that fire reached the dawn. The emergence from the narrow, suffocating confines of the ventilation duct onto the north face of the mountain felt like a second birth, a violent, gasping transition back into a reality where gravity and the biting cold were the absolute masters of the domain. Marcus was the first to push through, his broad shoulders straining against the rusted iron grate until it gave way with a sharp, metallic groan that was instantly swallowed by the whistling wind. As he stepped out onto a narrow, treacherous ledge of porous rock, he was struck by a gust of freezing air that carried the sharp scent of ozone and the grim promise of an unforgiving morning. He immediately assumed a low-profile security position, his 12-gauge shotgun scanning the mist-shrouded horizon as he reached back to assist Elena and Colonel Mendes in exiting the cramped concrete tunnel. Max leapt out behind them, his paws finding immediate traction on the slick, moss-covered granite, his entire body vibrating with a cocktail of suppressed adrenaline and heightened vigilance. They were now suspended between a dizzying abyss and the sheer, unforgiving wall of the mountain, at an altitude where the lush Amazonian canopy thinned into stunted, twisted trees that survived only through the sheer stubbornness of their roots. Below them, the sound of the internal explosions within the bunker began to manifest, not as sharp cracks, but as deep, subsonic vibrations that traveled up through the soles of their tactical boots. The very ground seemed to moan, a tectonic and metallic lament that signaled the catastrophic collapse of the lower levels of the observation tower. Marcus looked back and saw a thick, oily column of black smoke beginning to snake through the emerald canopy far below, marking the final resting place of the secrets Mendes had guarded for 2 decades. It was the definitive end of an era, a final purge that would leave no physical evidence of the bunker's existence, save for the psychological scars on those who had survived its depths. Colonel Mendes stood in a profound, heavy silence, watching the destruction of his long-time sanctuary with a gaze that held no trace of regret, only the quiet, dignified melancholy of a man who watches a significant part of his own life turn to ash so that another part might finally have the chance to breathe. Marcus said, while his eyes continuously tracked the steep, jagged trail that descended toward the valley where the morning mist remained stagnant and thick. The tower is gone. The purge sequence is doing its job, but that smoke is going to act as a beacon for the shadow hunters. We have very little time to gain significant distance before they reorganize their perimeter. Colonel, you mentioned a specific extraction point. We need to reach those coordinates before the full light of the sun reveals our silhouettes to their aerial assets. Colonel Mendes replied, clutching the wooden chest of letters tightly against his chest, before carefully sliding it into the main compartment of Marcus's rucksack with a renewed sense of purpose. The extraction site is at Hawks Plateau, about 3 kilometers from here if we follow the ridgeline through the gorge. It's a location that orbital satellites rarely monitor due to the permanent heavy cloud cover. I've maintained a low-frequency radio beacon there that can only be picked up by an old contact of mine, a pilot who owes me his life 10 times over. But the descent is treacherous, Marcus. This mountain does not like to be abandoned by those who know its secrets. They began the descent with a calculated, rhythmic caution. It was a slow-motion march of shadows through a world defined by shades of gray and deep, bruised greens. Marcus led the group, every step a tense negotiation between the force of gravity and the unstable soil composed of slick clay and loose, volcanic stones. Max operated as a flanking scout, using his superior senses to detect any thermal or acoustic anomalies along the mountain's ribs. The dogs seemed to intuitively understand that the threat was no longer just behind them. The very geography they were traversing was a constant, lethal adversary. Elena walked between the two men, her breath coming in heavy, audible gasps in the thin mountain air, yet her eyes shone with a feverish hope that no amount of physical exhaustion could extinguish. She looked toward her father with a frequency that betrayed a deep-seated fear that he might simply dissolve back into the mist if she dared to look away for even a single second. The silence of that long descent was unlike anything they had experienced in the dense jungle below. It was not the predatory silence of the undergrowth, but the vast, indifferent silence of the heights, where the howling wind was the only narrator of their struggle. Marcus felt the physical weight of the chest of letters in his pack as a sacred, almost spiritual responsibility. He found himself thinking about his own life, the countless missions he had executed as a Navy SEAL, the faces of the brothers he had seen fall in distant lands, and the crushing solitude he had chosen for himself as a form of both penance and protection. As he watched Mendes and Elena, he realized that the true path of stars was not the tactical route they had navigated, but the long, painful return to the humanity he had believed was lost forever in the shadows of his past. Suddenly, a sharp, mechanical thrumming sound sliced through the thin air above them. The rhythmic, percussive beating of helicopter rotors echoed off the granite walls of the gorge, amplified by the natural acoustics of the stone. Marcus instantly signaled for the group to press themselves against the sheer mountain wall, seeking cover beneath a jagged outcropping of rock heavily draped in thick, gray moss. A sleek, matte gray reconnaissance helicopter, devoid of any national markings or identifying numbers, swept past their position just meters from the ledge. The cold blue glow of its forward-looking infrared cameras varied across the mountainside with a clinical, unblinking precision. Marcus said, maintaining a firm, grounding pressure on Elena's shoulder to help camouflage her thermal signature against the cool stone. They're utilizing wide-spectrum heat sensors and ground-penetrating radar. If we remain stationary for too long, they'll pin our location within minutes. We need to time our movements with the strongest gusts of wind. The rapid shift in air temperature will create enough thermal noise to confuse their automated tracking. Max, stay low and don't break cover until I give the command. They continued their desperate descent under a shroud of unbearable tension. It was a high-stakes game of predator and prey played against cutting-edge technology, where Mendes's ancient knowledge of the mountain's hidden fissures and caves was their only effective shield. The colonel guided them through narrow, hidden capillaries in the rock that Marcus would have missed even with his advanced training. Passages carved by millennia of erosion that provided near-total concealment from aerial observation. Each time the helicopter thrummed overhead, they froze, becoming indistinguishable from the stone itself, while Max remained as motionless as a granite carving, his amber eyes fixed on the sky, with a somber, silent understanding of the threat above. After hours of a descent that pushed the limits of their tendons and their collective sanity, the group finally reached the edge of Hawk's Plateau. It was a wide, windswept expanse of flat rock and low-profile vegetation, almost constantly submerged in a white mist, so thick and heavy that it felt nearly solid. The air here was slightly warmer, but the humidity was absolute, coating every surface in a fine, persistent sheen of moisture. In the center of the plateau sat an old, weathered marking in the shape of an H, constructed from white river stones that Mendes had meticulously kept clear of moss for 2 decades. The colonel approached a small, natural fissure in the rock and retrieved a rugged portable radio unit powered by a long-life solar battery. Colonel Mendes said, his hand steady as he flipped the activation toggle. Sentinel to Eagle. The path of stars has been traversed. I repeat, the path of stars has been traversed. Requesting immediate exfiltration at Point Alpha 1. We have additional passengers on board. Do you copy, Eagle? The radio hissed with a long, agonizing burst of static, a dry, irritating sound that seemed to be the only response from the vast, indifferent wilderness. Elena gripped her father's hand, the raw anxiety written across her pale, weary face. Marcus remained at the very edge of the plateau, his shotgun held at the ready, his eyes scanning the narrow trail they had just descended. Max stood beside him, his ears pricked forward, capturing the distant rhythmic thud of heavy tactical boots ascending the slope. The shadow hunters had made landfall in the lower valleys and were now closing the net by land. The radio finally crackled with a distorted metallic voice that made Marcus's heart hammer against his ribs. Eagle to Sentinel! Message received loud and clear, old friend. We are 5 minutes out from your position. Maintain a live visual signal. The weather is closing in fast, Sentinel. We can't loiter in the hot zone for long. Be ready to move on arrival. Colonel Mendes looked at Marcus and then at his daughter, a look of profound relief and grim determination crossing his features. He reached into his vest, pulled out a magnesium signal flare, and struck the igniter. A brilliant, vibrant orange smoke began to plume upward, cutting through the thick whiteness of the mist like a desperate scream for survival. In the distance, the low, powerful drone of a turboprop engine began to draw closer, a sound distinctly different from the high-pitched whine of the search helicopter. It was an old, heavily modified seaplane, its silver hull glinting as it banked through a sudden gap in the clouds, like a great metallic bird of prey, Elena said, her voice rising above the sudden roar of the wind whipped up by the plane's approach. We actually made it, Marcus. We're going to get out of here, all of us together, Marcus said, as he watched the seaplane touch down on the plateau's natural runway and begin to taxi toward them, while Max let out a fierce, defensive bark at the first silhouettes of the shadow hunters emerging from the tree line. Get to the plane, now. Max and I will hold this perimeter and provide cover until you're safely on board. Don't look back, and don't stop moving for anything. Colonel Mendes hesitated for a heartbeat, looking at Marcus with a level of professional respect that transcended their old military hierarchy. He understood that the veteran was willing to be the final sacrifice of this long journey to ensure that the family he had reunited could finally find safety. Mendes reached out and gripped Marcus's shoulder with a firm, silent strength, a gesture that carried the weight of 1,000 unsaid words, and then guided Elena toward the open cargo door of the seaplane, where a weather-beaten pilot was gesturing frantically for them to hurry. Colonel Mendes shouted over the deafening roar of the engines and the whistling wind. Marcus, take the briefcase. It's yours by every right of honor. You've saved what was left of my soul, and you deserve a new life. Marcus looked at the silver aluminum briefcase that Elena was desperately trying to hand to him as she climbed the boarding steps. He could see the intoxicating glint of the gold bars and the thick bricks of currency through the open lid. He looked at Max, who was now in a full combat stance, snapping at the air as the first rounds from the pursuers began to strike the plateau's surface with sharp, stony impacts. Marcus took the briefcase from Elena's trembling hands, but instead of stowing it, he firmly handed it back to Colonel Mendes. Marcus said, his voice calm and resolute despite the chaos erupting around them. I don't need gold to survive in the shadows, Colonel. Use that wealth to give Elena the life you drew for her in those letters. I'm taking only one thing as my payment for this contract. He reached into his rucksack, opened the wooden chest for a split second, and retrieved a small, unassuming object. The old wooden rosary that Colonel Mendes had carried for 20 long years. Marcus wrapped the worn beads around his left wrist, securing them beside the indigenous seed necklace. To him, this small piece of wood held more weight and true value than all the precious metal in the world. It was the ultimate symbol of the human spirit's resilience against the crushing weight of total darkness, Elena said, her eyes streaming with tears as she tried to catch Marcus's hand one last time before the cargo door was pulled shut. Thank you, Marcus, for everything. You will always have a place with us. no matter where in this world we end up. Marcus simply nodded once and gave 2 firm thumps against the seaplane's fuselage, signaling the pilot to initiate takeoff. The aircraft roared to life, its propellers becoming a blur as it accelerated across the rocky plateau, its hull finally lifting into the air and vanishing almost instantly into the thick, protective blanket of the clouds. Marcus and Max stood alone on Hawk's plateau. The veteran fired a controlled spread from his shotgun toward the shadow hunters, who were now flooding onto the plateau, not to kill, but to force them into cover while he and the dog slipped into a secondary, pre-scouted escape route through a narrow chimney in the rock. They would not be taken. The mountain and the mist were their oldest allies, and they knew the way home. The journey back to the cabin for Marcus and Max took 3 days of silent, deeply contemplative trekking through the heart of the rainforest. The frantic, high-stakes pace of the escape had been replaced by the slow, restorative rhythm of 2 partners processing a profound transformation. They walked without the previous urgency, stopping frequently to observe the sunset bleeding across the winding rivers that looked like veins of liquid silver far below the ridges. The silence of the jungle no longer felt like a predatory threat. It felt like a familiar, comforting dialogue. Marcus felt the jagged scar on his neck pulse with a different kind of energy. No longer the phantom pain of a past failure, but the steady thrum of a present life that had been reclaimed. He was no longer just the officer who had failed his unit. He was the man who had completed the most important mission of his existence. When they finally broke through the tree line into the familiar clearing where his cabin stood, the sun was beginning to set, bathing the weathered timber of the shack in deep, warm tones of amber and gold. The place looked exactly as they had left it, but Marcus's perception of it had fundamentally shifted. He unbolted the door, and the familiar scent of wood smoke, strong coffee, and gun oil welcomed him back like a long-lost friend. Max immediately trotted to his water bowl, drinking deeply before collapsing onto his fiber rug with a long, contented sigh of relief. The isolation had returned, but the crushing weight of the solitude had finally dissipated. Marcus sat on the small wooden porch, the wooden rosary of Colonel Mendes wrapped around his wrist, catching the last fading light of the day. He looked out at the immense emerald forest, the path of stars now hidden once again beneath the thick green canopy. He knew that Elena and the Colonel were safe, somewhere far from this wilderness, beginning a new life that had only been made possible by the cold courage of a veteran and the unwavering loyalty of a dog. He accepted the peace that the jungle offered him, knowing that while the physical scars remained, the heart of the sentinel was finally at rest. Marcus said to Max, as the first true star of the evening began to shine with a solitary, brilliant light in the darkening Amazonian sky. "We did the right thing, Max. The fortune we brought back from that mountain doesn't fit inside aluminum briefcases. It's right here, in this silence, that finally doesn't hurt us anymore. Good work, partner. Get some sleep. Tomorrow this jungle is still ours, but the world is a little bit brighter because of what we did in the dark." Max simply closed his eyes, his notched left ear finally relaxed, his paws moving slightly as if he were still running through his dreams along the path of stars. The return of the sentinel was complete. The absolute darkness of the night fell over the cabin, but inside, the light of a promise kept shone with more intensity than any bioluminescent fungus could ever hope to achieve. Marcus cleaned his weapon one last time, not out of tactical necessity, but as a ritual of profound gratitude to the tools that had brought him home. He was Marcus, the sentinel of the jungle, and his story was now written in the stars, in the soil, and in the hearts of those he had dared to save. The silence was total, and for the first time in 20 years, Marcus slept without being pursued by the ghosts of what he had left behind. The journey was over, and a new life, slow and filled with quiet purpose, was beginning under the watchful eye of the indifferent and majestic Amazon. The gentle breeze of the night carried the distant, soothing sound of the river, a lullaby for the exhausted warrior. The weight of his duty had been replaced by the lightness of his redemption. He knew that other mysteries would eventually arise, that other strangers might one day knock on his door. But for now, he was ready. He had Max by his side, the memories of Mendes on his wrist, and the absolute certainty that honor is the only compass that never fails, even in the places where the stars fall to earth. And so, in the stillness of the largest forest on the planet, the sentinel rested, watched over by the very lights he had helped to protect. The end of that story was not a definitive period, but a hopeful ellipsis. Marcus turned off the shortwave radio. He would never need to monitor for Mendes again, and blew out the lamp. In the deep darkness, he could feel Max's steady presence and the calm, rhythmic beat of his own heart. He was a part of this geography now, an element of the flora and fauna, a guardian who finally understood that the greatest inestimable treasure is the freedom to choose one's own path, and the peace of having honored those who came before. The path of stars would continue to shine for those who knew where to look, but for Marcus, the path now led only to home. He closed his eyes, and in the profound silence of the Amazonian night, he finally found his own place under the infinite sky. Marcus said, in a whisper that was lost to the wind, "Mission accomplished, Colonel. Rest easy. We're home."